The logging road between Mackenzie and Bear Lake stretches through some of the most isolated terrain in northern British Columbia. In February 2019, RCMP received a call about an abandoned pickup truck at mile 97, engine still running, driver's door hanging open. The truck belonged to Dennis Horvath, a 43-year-old millwright who'd been driving home after a 2-week shift at the pulp mill. Dennis was known for his reliability. His ex-wife, Marie, told investigators he'd texted her at 11:47 p.m. saying he'd stopped to check on what looked like someone standing in the road. The message ended mid-sentence. "They're not MOV." Search and rescue found his phone in the snow 15 meters from the vehicle, screen cracked, but still functional. The last photo in his camera roll, time-stamped 11:46 p.m., showed the road ahead illuminated by headlights. At the very edge of the frame, barely visible, was a dark figure. Enhancement revealed it wasn't standing on the road. It was standing approximately 2 feet above it. The search continued for 9 days. Temperatures held steady at -30. They found a single set of Dennis's boot prints leading into the trees, stride irregular, as if he'd been running. The prints stopped abruptly after 60 meters at a small clearing. No signs of struggle, no blood, no body. What disturbed the search team most was what they found in that clearing. A perfect circle of dead ravens, 23 birds arranged like numbers on a clock face, all frozen solid. The conservation officer said they'd been dead for weeks, possibly months. Yet something had placed them there recently. The snow beneath them had only fallen 3 days prior. Dennis's sister posted on Facebook asking if anyone had seen unusual lights on the logging roads that night. She received 47 responses. Most described the same thing: a pale blue glow moving between the trees, always staying parallel to the road, visible for only a few seconds before vanishing. 3 people mentioned seeing it near mile 97. The official report listed Dennis as missing, presumed dead due to exposure. But Marie kept his phone. She couldn't stop looking at that photograph, zooming in on the figure. The more she looked, the more she became convinced it had no legs, just a torso and head, suspended in the darkness. 2 weeks after the search was called off, Marie drove to mile 97 herself. She parked where Dennis's truck had been found and waited until dark. She never told anyone what she saw that night, but when she returned to Mackenzie at 3 a.m., her hair had gone completely white at the roots. She sold Dennis's truck the next day and moved to Prince George. She left one cryptic post on the community forum: "Don't stop if you see someone on the winter roads. They're not people, they're marks." The thread was deleted by moderators within hours, but not before 17 people had screenshotted it. One of those people was Constable James Pettigrew of the Mackenzie RCMP detachment. He'd been the first officer on scene at mile 97. He knew something the public didn't. Dennis Horvath wasn't the first disappearance on that stretch of road. He was the 7th in 18 months. The RCMP had kept it quiet to avoid panic, but Pettigrew had started his own file. He called it the mile 97 pattern. All 7 victims had vanished on nights when the temperature dropped below -25. All 7 had either called or texted someone immediately before disappearing, mentioning a figure on the road. And in 4 cases where vehicles were recovered with phones still inside, the last photo showed the same thing. Something dark, suspended in the headlight beams, exactly 2 feet off the ground. Pettigrew had become obsessed. He'd driven that road 24 times, always at night, always in winter. He'd never seen anything unusual, but he'd felt it. A pressure in his chest, a certainty that something was watching from the trees. His wife begged him to drop it. His sergeant ordered him to focus on other cases. But Pettigrew couldn't let it go, especially after he found the old newspaper article from 1983, a story about a contractor named William Marsh who disappeared on the same stretch of road. The article mentioned Marsh had been working on a project for BC Hydro, surveying potential sites for a transmission line that was never built. The article included a quote from Marsh's supervisor. Bill radioed in around midnight, saying he'd found something strange in the woods. Markers, he called them, like survey stakes, but wrong somehow. He said he was going to take a closer look. That was the last we heard from him. Pettigrew traced the survey route on old maps. It passed directly through the clearing where they'd found the circle of ravens. He made a decision he didn't share with anyone. He would spend a night at mile 97, not in his police vehicle, but in his personal truck, unmarked, with camping gear. He would wait and watch. If something was out there leaving marks in the snow and taking people, he would find it. His wife reported him missing on March 3, 2019. His truck was found at mile 97, engine running, driver's door open. On the passenger seat was his notebook, open to the last page. In his handwriting, growing increasingly erratic, they're not marks. They're markers. Something is counting. The Pettigrew disappearance sent shockwaves through Mackenzie. A police officer vanishing on the same stretch of road where 7 others had gone missing couldn't be kept quiet any longer. The Vancouver media descended on the town of 3,000, turning the local Tim Hortons into an impromptu press headquarters. Among the reporters was Sarah Chun, a freelance journalist from Victoria who specialized in cold cases. She'd been following the Mile 97 disappearances through online forums and had convinced the CBC to fund a documentary. While other journalists chased sound bites from traumatized family members, Sarah focused on something else: the phrase Constable Pettigrew had written in his notebook. Something is counting. She rented a room at the Mackenzie Hotel and spent her first 3 days reading everything she could find at the public library. Census records, old newspapers, mining reports, forestry surveys. She was looking for patterns, numbers, anything that might explain what Pettigrew had meant. On her 4th day, she met Douglas Keller. He appeared at her library table without warning, a man in his 70s with weathered hands and eyes that seemed permanently squinted against wind that wasn't there. He placed a yellowed photograph on the desk in front of her. "You're asking the wrong questions," he said. The photo showed a wooden building, more of a shack really, standing in a cleared area surrounded by snow-covered forest. On the door was a hand-painted number, 97. "What is this?" Sarah asked. "The counting house. That's what the old-timers called it. My grandfather worked the trap lines up past Bear Lake in the 1930s. He said the counting house had been there long before any loggers or miners. The Dakel people wouldn't go near it. They said it was a place where the dead were measured." Douglas sat down without invitation. "My grandfather saw it once, in winter. Said the door was open and he could see marks on the walls inside. Scratches, like someone keeping tally. He counted as much as he could see. Got to 97 before something made him run. He wouldn't say what." Sarah leaned forward. "Where was this building?" "Can't say exactly. Grandfather's maps were crude, but he marked it in his journal. About 15 miles north of where the pulp mill is now, near where they found those ravens." Douglas tapped the photograph. "This picture was taken in 1947. BC Forest Service sent a crew to tear it down. Said it was a safety hazard." "Did they tear it down?" Douglas's expression darkened. "Crew of 4 men went in. 3 came out. The one who didn't, Frank Hutchins, they found him sitting inside the building, frozen solid, eyes open. He'd scratched 98 new marks into the walls. 98. One more than my grandfather counted." Sarah felt her skin prickle. "What happened to the building?" "They burned it, doused it in diesel, and lit it up. But my grandfather always said you can't burn a count. The numbers remember." Douglas stood to leave, then paused. "You want to know what's happening on that road? Start with the numbers. Count everything. How many disappeared? What mile marker? Temperatures. Dates. Everything's a count, Miss Chun. And something is keeping score." After he left, Sarah opened her laptop and created a spreadsheet. She input every detail she'd gathered. 8 disappearances, including Pettigrew, all between mile 95 and mile 99, all when temperatures were below -25 Celsius. She added dates, times, ages of victims. Then she added something she'd noticed but hadn't thought significant: the number of days between disappearances. The pattern was irregular: 47 days, 31 days, 62 days, 41 days, 53 days, 38 days, 44 days. She stared at the numbers. They seemed random until she noticed something. She added them up, 316 days total. She divided by 7 disappearances, 45.14 days average. Her hands trembled as she checked her math again. The numbers were trying to tell her something. But what? She spent the next 6 hours in a fugue state, barely aware of the librarian announcing closing time. She'd expanded her research, finding references to other disappearances in northern BC going back decades. The patterns were there if you knew how to look. Clusters of vanishings, always in winter, always near certain mile markers, always followed by gaps of 30 to 60 days. It was past midnight when she returned to her hotel room. She'd filled 3 notebooks with figures, dates, coordinates. She arranged them on the bed, photographing each page for backup, and then she saw it. The disappearances weren't random. They were geographical markers. When she plotted them on a map, they formed a shape, not a circle or a line, but something more complex. She counted the points, 97 locations across northern BC, spanning from 1931 to the present. 97. Douglas's words echoed. Got to 97 before something made him run. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Stop counting. She stared at the screen, heart hammering. Another text arrived. You're making yourself visible. The hotel room suddenly felt too warm, too exposed. She moved to the window and looked out at the parking lot. The streetlights cast long shadows across the snow. Near the tree line at the edge of the property, something stood perfectly still. At first, she thought it was a person. Then she realized it couldn't be. It wasn't standing on the ground. Sarah stepped back from the window, fumbling for her phone to call 911. Before she could dial, the lights in her room flickered and died. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in dim red. When she looked out the window again, the figure was gone. But on the frost-covered glass, something, had traced a number, 98. She grabbed her laptop, notebooks, and keys, and ran. Sarah drove through the night, not stopping until she reached Prince George 90 minutes south. She checked into a chain hotel under a fake name and sat in the bathtub with the lights on until dawn, trying to convince herself she'd imagined it. But she hadn't imagined the number on the window. She'd photographed it before fleeing, a clear 98, drawn in the frost from the outside. She was the 98th count. When she finally worked up the courage to check her laptop, she found her spreadsheet had been altered. A new column had appeared, one she hadn't created. It contained a single word repeated 98 times, marked. Sarah Chin never published her documentary. She returned to Victoria and refused to discuss what happened in Mackenzie. But she kept a private blog, password protected, where she continued tracking disappearances in northern BC. The count reached 99 in April 2019. A hunter named Robert Tate vanished near mile 97. His family found his truck with a note on the dashboard, written in his handwriting. I understand now. The markers aren't points on a map. They're people. It needs 100. Dr. Ellen Moss had practiced psychiatry in Prince George for 12 years. She specialized in trauma, and in the winter of 2019, she began seeing an unusual number of patients presenting with similar symptoms: severe insomnia, intrusive thoughts about numbers, and an overwhelming fear of being watched when outdoors after dark. The first was Marie Horvath, widow of Dennis, the millwright who disappeared at mile 97. Marie came in March, her once black hair now dramatically white-streaked, hands shaking as she filled out intake forms. I can't sleep, she told Ellen. Every time I close my eyes, I see numbers, counting up, 97, 98, 99, over and over. And I know, something terrible is going to happen when it reaches 100. Ellen prescribed standard anxiety medication and scheduled weekly sessions. She would have categorized it as typical grief response with obsessive features, except 3 weeks later, a journalist named Sarah Chun made an emergency appointment with identical symptoms. Sarah was harder to dismiss. She brought evidence, photographs, spreadsheets, maps covered in calculations. She spoke in rapid bursts about patterns of disappearances, geographical markers, something called the counting house. I'm not crazy, Sarah insisted. I'm marked. Number 98. I can feel it watching, waiting. It marked me, and now I can't unmark myself. Do you understand? You can't unmark yourself. Ellen listened professionally, made notes about possible psychotic break, and recommended a higher level of care. But that night, alone in her home office reviewing case files, she noticed something that made her pause. Both women had mentioned the number 97 in their first sessions. Both had described a sensation of being watched by something that didn't stand on the ground. Both had drastically changed their routines, refusing to drive on rural roads, keeping lights on at all hours, checking and rechecking locks. Ellen pulled up news articles about the mile 97 disappearances. 8 people missing, including a police officer. All vanished from the same remote stretch of road. She read Constable Pettigrew's final note. Something is counting. Professional skepticism warred with a growing unease. Ellen had built her career on evidence-based treatment, on distinguishing between genuine trauma and delusional thinking. But two patients with no connection to each other, presenting with identical unusual symptoms? She decided to investigate further, not as a therapist, but as a researcher. If there was some environmental cause, carbon monoxide, shared contamination, local folklore creating mass hysteria, she needed to understand it. Ellen spent the next week conducting informal interviews. She discovered 11 other people in Prince George who'd visited the Mile 97 area in recent months and developed similar symptoms. Most hadn't sought professional help, but they talked to her. A pattern emerged. They'd all seen something. A figure on or near the road, suspended in air, dark against the snow. They'd all felt marked afterward, watched by something patient and inevitable. And they'd all become obsessed with numbers, particularly the counting sequence from 97 to 100. One man, a truck driver named Gary Lund, told her, "It's like I picked up a signal. Like my brain is suddenly a receiver for something that was always broadcasting, but I couldn't hear it before. And now I can't turn it off." A receiver. The word stuck with Ellen. She began experiencing insomnia herself, though she attributed it to stress. She'd taken on too much, let these cases consume her. She needed distance, perspective. But at 3 a.m., lying awake, she found herself counting. 97, 98, 99. She caught herself and stopped, heart racing. This was suggestion, nothing more. Power of belief. She was too rational to fall victim to mass hysteria. But when she checked her security camera footage the next morning, she'd installed cameras after a break-in 2 years prior. She saw something that made her blood freeze. At 3:17 a.m., a figure had appeared at the edge of her property. It stood motionless among the trees, just beyond the reach of her porch light. The camera's night vision rendered it as a pale shape, roughly humanoid but distorted, stretched wrong. And it wasn't standing on the ground. It hovered, exactly at the height of a tall person's head, as if the ground were 2 feet lower than it actually was. Ellen watched the footage 3 times. The figure remained for 7 minutes, then vanished between frames. There 1 second, gone the next, with no transition. She called the police. They sent a constable who examined the property, found no tracks, no signs of trespassing. He suggested a camera malfunction, maybe a strange reflection. Ellen nodded and thanked him, but she knew what she'd seen. That night, she didn't sleep at all. She sat in her living room with every light blazing, laptop open, diving deeper into research. She found Douglas Keller's name in an old forum thread, tracked down his number, called him at 6 a.m. "Dr. Moss," he said, before she'd introduced herself. "You've seen it, haven't you?" "How did you?" "Because you're calling. People only call me when they've seen it, when they've become receivers." His voice was tired, resigned. "My grandfather was one. I'm one. Now you're one. I don't understand what that means." "It means you picked up the signal. You got too close to the count, and now you're part of it. You can perceive what's happening. The markers, the counting, the thing that's been doing it for longer than anyone knows." Ellen's hands shook. "What is it? What's counting?" "My grandfather had a theory. The Dakel people have stories about a spirit that measures the boundary between the living and the dead. Not a gatekeeper, a surveyor. It counts the places where the boundary is thin, marks them. When it finishes its count, when it reaches the number it needs." Douglas paused. Something happens. A door opens, or closes. Grandfather wasn't sure which would be worse. "How do I stop this? How do I stop being a receiver?" "You don't. Once you're marked, you're marked. Best you can do is what I do. Keep track, stay alert, and whatever you do, don't be the 100th. Don't be the one that completes the count." Ellen ended the call feeling worse than before. She tried to return to normal life, seeing patients, maintaining routines. But she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and the numbers wouldn't stop. She found herself counting everything. Steps to her car, tiles on the ceiling, heartbeats in a minute. 97, 98, 99. 3 weeks after seeing the figure on her camera, Ellen received a call from the hospital. Sarah Chun had been admitted after a suicide attempt. She tried to hang herself in her Victoria apartment, left a note that read, "I won't be the 100th. I refuse to complete it." Sarah survived, but the note terrified Ellen. If Sarah was 98, and she tried to remove herself from the count, who was 99. Ellen found the answer in a news article from McKinsey, dated 2 days prior. Robert Tate, Hunter, missing near mile 97. Family found a note about refusing to be the 100th. The count was at 99, one away from completion. Ellen understood with sudden, horrible clarity. The receivers weren't random. They were people who'd gotten too close to understanding the pattern. They'd been marked because they'd seen the mechanism. And if the count reached 100, if whatever was doing this completed its survey, she couldn't let herself think about what might happen. That night, Ellen made a decision. She would go to mile 97. She would document everything with cameras, recording equipment, scientific instruments. She would approach this rationally, gather empirical evidence. If something was there, if something was counting, she would prove it existed and force a proper investigation. She didn't tell anyone her plan. In retrospect, she would recognize this as the first sign that she was no longer thinking clearly, that being a receiver had compromised her judgment. Ellen loaded her SUV with equipment and drove north. She reached mile 97 at 10 p.m. on a clear March night, temperature minus 28. She set up her cameras, her recorder, her laptop. She waited. At 11:34 p.m., her thermometer registered a sudden drop, minus 32. At 11:35 p.m., her cameras detected movement at the tree line. At 11:36 p.m., Ellen Moss understood what the count meant, what it had always meant. She grabbed her phone with shaking hands and texted Douglas Keller. "It's not counting people. It's counting doors. The markers are doors, and they're all opening." She hit send, then looked up at what was emerging from the trees. Her last thought was a number, 100. Ellen's SUV was found the next morning, engine running, driver's door open. Her equipment was still recording. The cameras showed her getting out of the vehicle and walking toward the tree line. She moved stiffly, like someone under compulsion, not fear. The footage ended abruptly at 11:43 p.m. When RCMP reviewed it, they found the final 7 minutes were heavily corrupted, strange visual artifacts, audio distortion. But in the last clear frame, you could see Ellen standing at the edge of the forest, surrounded by what looked like 20 or 30 figures, all suspended 2 feet above the snow. She was looking up at something the camera couldn't capture. Douglas Keller saw her text, but didn't respond. He'd already left McKinsey, driving south with no particular destination. He just knew he needed to be away from the north, away from the count. He would never return to British Columbia, and he would never stop feeling like he was being watched, marked, measured by something patient and thorough, something that had just reached 100. The spring of 2019 arrived late to northern British Columbia. Snow persisted into April, ice on the lakes remaining thick enough to walk on through the first week of May. But when the thaw finally came, it came fast. The ice on Williston Lake, the massive reservoir created by the W.C. Bennett Dam, broke up in a matter of days. And as the ice retreated, the lake began giving things back. On May 8th, a fisherman named Tom Whitmore discovered a body floating near the boat launch at McKenzie Bay. RCMP identified it as Dennis Horvath, the millwright who'd vanished at mile 97 in February. Despite spending 3 months in frozen water, the body showed minimal decomposition. But there was something wrong with it, something the autopsy report struggled to articulate. Dr. Patricia Okoye, the pathologist who examined Horvath, noted several irregularities in her official report. Unofficially, she confided to the investigating officer that it was the strangest body she'd examined in 20 years of practice. "The tissue damage isn't consistent with drowning or exposure," she explained. "It's more like systematic collapse, as if something had methodically shut down each system one by one. Heart, lungs, liver, all showing signs of failure, but in sequence, not simultaneously. And there are these marks." She showed him photographs. Along Horvath's spine and across his chest were faint indentations, barely visible, forming patterns that looked almost like tally marks. She'd counted them, 97. "Could be post-mortem damage from ice or debris," she said, but her tone suggested she didn't believe it. Or something marked him before he died. The marks are too precise to be natural. The discovery of Horvath's body was disturbing enough. But over the next 3 days, the lake gave up 6 more bodies. All had vanished along the mile 97 corridor between 2017 and 2019. All showed similar patterns of systematic shutdown. All bore those strange tally mark indentations, the number varying with each victim. Constable Pettigrew's body emerged on May 10th. He had 99 marks. Dr. Ellen Moss was pulled from the water on May 11th. She had 100. The 8th victim from the mile 97 disappearances, Robert Tate, the hunter, was never found. His absence troubled investigators more than the presence of the others. 7 recovered, 1 missing. The count felt incomplete. The RCMP convened a special task force. The official explanation was that the victims had somehow ended up in the lake through a combination of disorientation, exposure, and the rough terrain. Perhaps they'd stumbled down ravines leading to tributaries that fed into Williston Lake. It was thin, but it was rational. What they couldn't explain was the timeline. Williston Lake was 15 to 30 kilometers from mile 97, depending on which tributary system you followed. How had the victims traveled that distance in sub-zero temperatures, leaving no tracks, no traces? And why did they all end up in the lake? More disturbing were the reports from the recovery teams. 3 separate divers mentioned seeing something strange during the retrieval operations. Shapes moving beneath the ice before the thaw, visible through the translucent surface. Not bodies drifting, something active, almost purposeful. One diver, a 20-year veteran named Marcus LeBlanc, refused to enter the water after his second dive. When pressed, he only said, "There's something down there that isn't drowned. It's waiting." The lake became a focus of unwanted attention. Media returned, this time with underwater camera crews and sonar equipment. A true crime podcast team from Toronto spent a week filming on the shores, interviewing locals, collecting stories. That's when the patterns started expanding. A researcher from UBC named Dr. James Rothwell had been studying historical records of BC Hydro's construction of the WAC Bennett Dam in the 1960s. The dam had flooded an enormous area, creating Williston Lake and displacing several indigenous communities. Rothwell discovered something in the archived records that made him contact the RCMP task force. Before the flooding, he told them, there were extensive surveys of what would be submerged. The BC Power Commission documented everything: old homesteads, trap lines, indigenous sites. But there was one structure they specifically noted and recommended destroying before the reservoir filled. They called it the counting station. He showed them a grainy photograph from 1966, a small wooden building in a cleared area, surrounded by spruce trees. On the door was a painted number, 97. The survey team's notes say the building contained indigenous markings of unknown origin and purpose, potentially dangerous to preserve. The recommendation was to burn it. But there's no follow-up documentation. I can't confirm it was actually destroyed. The task force leader, Sergeant Diana Holbrook, stared at the photograph. Where was this located? Based on the survey coordinates, it would now be underwater, approximately 50 meters from where Dennis Horvath's body was found. The room fell silent. There's something else, Rothwell continued. The Dakel and Saikani peoples have oral histories about that area. They called it the counting place. According to their traditions, it was where the boundary between worlds was measured. They performed rituals to keep the boundary stable, to prevent what they called the miscount. What happens during a miscount? Holbrook asked. The stories are vague, but the implication is that if the count reaches completion without proper ritual intervention, the boundary fails. The dead don't stay dead. The living don't stay living. The worlds merge. Holbrook wanted to dismiss it as folklore, but she couldn't ignore the facts. 8 people vanished near mile 97. 7 recovered from the lake bearing strange marks. 1 still missing. The number 97 kept appearing on the old building, at the mile marker, on the victims' bodies. And now they had 100 marks on Dr. Ellen Moss. What completed the count? She asked Rothwell. If Moss was the 100th, what happens now? I don't know. The stories don't say. They only warn that completion must be prevented. That night, Holbrook couldn't sleep. She reviewed every file, every photograph, every witness statement. Something nagged at her, a detail she'd overlooked. It came to her at 3 a.m. The 8th victim, Robert Tate, had never been found. 7 bodies recovered, 1 missing. But Ellen Moss had 100 marks. If Tate was 99 and Moss was 100, who had been 98? She pulled up Sarah Chen's file. The journalist who'd investigated mile 97, who'd attempted suicide, claiming she was marked as 98. But Chun had survived. She was alive in Victoria, under psychiatric care. Could you be counted if you were still alive? Holbrook called the Victoria Police Department, asked them to perform a wellness check on Sarah Chun. They called back 2 hours later. Sarah Chun had vanished from her apartment sometime during the night. No signs of struggle, no note. But written on her bathroom mirror in condensation, 98 complete. The miscount is corrected. The door holds. Holbrook felt ice in her stomach. Sarah had been marked as 98 but had survived her suicide attempt, disrupting the count. Now she was gone, and the count was corrected, which meant the sequence was complete. 97 marks on earlier victims, 98 on Chun, 99 on Tate, 100 on Moss. Whatever was supposed to happen at 100 had already begun. Over the next week, reports started filtering in from across northern BC. Strange occurrences, all centered around areas with histories of disappearances. People seeing figures on roads at night, always hovering above the ground. Unexplained sounds from frozen lakes. Not ice cracking, but something else. Something like counting. Williston Lake refroze in several places despite warming temperatures. Locals reported seeing shapes moving beneath the new ice, shadows that didn't correspond to anything above. The Mackenzie detachment received dozens of calls about lights in the forest near mile 97, pale blue glows that moved between trees, never staying in one place long enough to investigate. And people started finding marks, tally-like scratches appearing on homes, vehicles, even on their own skin. Always in sequences, 97, 98, 99, 100. Sergeant Holbrook organized a dive team to investigate the site where the counting house had stood before the flooding. She had to know if the building was still there, submerged under 50 years of silt and water. The dive was scheduled for May 20th. Holbrook didn't tell anyone outside the core team. She selected 3 experienced divers and a support crew. They launched at dawn from a small boat at Mackenzie Bay. The water was murky from spring runoff. Visibility less than 2 meters. The divers descended, following a planned grid pattern. At 47 meters, they found the remains of the old forest, tree stumps and debris from before the flooding. At 51 meters, they found the building. It hadn't been destroyed. It stood intact, perfectly preserved, door closed. The number 97 was still visible, the paint somehow undeteriorated despite decades underwater. The lead diver, Marcus LeBlanc, the same one who'd refused to dive during body recovery, approached the structure with his camera. He could see scratch marks covering the walls, thousands of them, layer upon layer. Through the murky water and the thick glass of his mask, he saw the door swing slowly open. He should have ascended immediately. Every instinct screamed at him to rise. But something drew him closer. He needed to see inside, needed to understand what had been counting all these years. The interior was larger than it should have been. The camera footage would later show this impossible spatial distortion. A small shack that contained what looked like a vast chamber, filled with vertical marks on every surface. And in the center, something dark and indefinite, neither solid nor liquid, present but not quite visible. Marcus reached out toward it. His hand passed the threshold of the doorway. On the surface, Holbrook saw the dive line go suddenly slack. She hauled on it. But there was no resistance. The line had been severed. She screamed into the radio for the other divers to surface immediately. 2 of the 3 came up. Marcus LeBlanc did not. The recovered divers were incoherent, speaking in fragments about marks everywhere, and it's still counting. One couldn't stop scratching at his arm, drawing blood, making tally marks in his own flesh. The camera footage from Marcus's rig stopped transmitting at the moment he touched the doorway. When the RCMP technical team reviewed the recovered footage, they found something impossible. In the final frame, as Marcus's hand extended into the building, you could see figures inside, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all those who'd been counted over the decades. They stood in perfect stillness, suspended in the dark water, their bodies marked with tallies. And in the corner of the frame, barely visible, was Marcus's future, his own body, already marked, already counted, standing among the others though he hadn't yet died. The dive site was immediately closed. The RCMP recommended the military be called in to destroy the structure with explosives. But when they returned to the site 2 days later, the building was gone. The lake floor where it had stood showed no sign it had ever been there. Just smooth silt, undisturbed. Marcus LeBlanc's body surfaced on May 23rd, 3 days after the dive. It bore 101 marks. The count had not stopped at 100. It had never stopped. It was still counting. Thomas Coyne had lived alone at Bear Lake for 30 years. His cabin sat at the northeastern end of the lake, accessible only by logging road, 15 miles from the nearest neighbor. He trapped in winter, guided fishing parties in summer, and preferred the company of silence to people. In late May 2019, he broke his pattern and drove to McKenzie. He walked into the RCMP detachment and asked to speak to whoever was handling the Mile 97 situation. They brought him to Sergeant Holbrook. "There's something watching my lake," he told her without preamble. "Been there about a month now. Started around the time the thaw came." Holbrook, still reeling from the dive incident, almost dismissed him. Another frightened local seeing shadows. But something in Coyne's manner stopped her. He wasn't frightened. He was observing, reporting. "What do you mean by something?" she asked. "Can't describe it properly. It doesn't have a fixed shape. Some days it looks like a person standing on the far shore. Other days it's in the trees or on the water, but it's always watching. Always in the same position relative to my cabin, no matter where I go on the lake. Like it's tracking me. Could it be a person? Another trapper or camper? I thought that at first. I even called out a few times, figured maybe someone was lost. But it doesn't respond. Doesn't move like a person either. It's there, then it isn't. Then it's there again in a different spot, but always the same distance away. Always watching." Coyne pulled out his phone and showed her photographs. In each image, taken from his cabin, from his boat, from various points around the lake, there was a dark shape in the background. Never clear, never quite in focus, but present. And he was right. The position relative to his location remained constant. "This started in late April?" Holbrook asked. "Around the 23rd, 24th. Same time the ice broke up. The same time Ellen Moss's body was pulled from Williston Lake. The same time the count supposedly reached 100. Has it done anything? Approached your cabin? Made any aggressive moves?" "Not exactly. But things have been changing. Fish aren't biting the same. Birds stopped coming to my feeders. And there are marks." "What kind of marks?" Coyne showed her more photos. Tally marks scratched into trees around his property, always in sequences of 97 through 101. He'd counted 87 marked trees so far. Holbrook felt the familiar chill. "Mr. Coyne, I need you to leave your cabin. Stay with family or friends in town. Don't go back there alone." "Can't do that. That's my home. Whatever this is, it's not driving me out." He stood to leave, then paused. "I'm not reporting this because I'm scared, Sergeant. I'm reporting it because I think it's connected to what happened at Mile 97, and I think it's spreading." After Coyne left, Holbrook pulled up maps of the area. Bear Lake was 17 kilometers northeast of Mile 97. If something had been released or activated by the completion of the count, it might be expanding outward from the source. She contacted Dr. James Rothwell, the UBC researcher who'd found the counting house records. Could whatever was at Mile 97 move? Could it change locations? "The oral histories mention mobility," Rothwell said. "The boundary between worlds isn't fixed. It shifts with the seasons, with rituals, with death. If the counting place was anchoring something, and that anchor was disrupted, then yes, theoretically it could relocate or expand. What would that look like? According to the stories, the boundary becomes visible. The thing that measures it becomes perceivable to those nearby. It's called the Watcher in some versions, the entity that maintains the count, that marks the doors between worlds." Holbrook thought of Coyne's description, always watching, always the same distance away. If someone is being watched, what does that mean? Are they in danger? The stories differ. Some say the Watcher only observes, that being seen by it is the danger, not it seeing you. Others say it marks those it watches, adding them to the count. The Dakel performed rituals to avoid its attention, to remain uncounted. How do you avoid being counted? That knowledge was closely held by specific families. Most of it was lost when the communities were displaced by the dam construction. But the general principle was to avoid acknowledgement. Don't look directly at it. Don't count yourself. Don't mark your own presence. Holbrook ended the call and sat in the silent office. Don't count yourself. Don't mark your own presence. It felt like folklore, superstition. But she couldn't ignore the pattern. Everyone who'd investigated the Mile 97 disappearances too closely had become marked, had become receivers. They'd made themselves visible to whatever was counting. She made a decision: no more direct investigation of the phenomena. They would monitor from a distance, collect data passively, but not engage. She issued orders to her team: no more dive operations, no more site visits to mile 97, no interviews about the marks or the watcher. But it was too late for Thomas Coyne. On June 2nd, 2 fishermen discovered Coyne's boat drifting on Bear Lake. The motor was off, or still in their locks. Coyne's fishing rod was cast out, the line taut, as if he'd hooked something large. They found Coyne in the water, 20 meters from his boat. He was alive, but unresponsive, eyes open and fixed on something they couldn't see. They hauled him into their boat and radioed for help. At the hospital in Mackenzie, Coyne remained catatonic for 3 days. He breathed, his heart beat, but he showed no awareness of his surroundings. Neurological tests revealed no physical damage. It was as if he'd simply left. On the 3rd day, he spoke. A nurse was changing his when Coyne's eyes suddenly focused. He grabbed her arm with surprising strength and said, "It counted me. I'm 102. I looked at it, and it counted me." Then he started scratching at his chest, tearing his hospital gown. The nurse called for help, and orderlies restrained him. When they examined his chest, they found fresh marks, not scratched by his nails, but appearing spontaneously, as if carved from beneath the skin. 102 tally marks, precise and even. Coyne died that night. The official cause was cardiac arrest, but the attending physician noted that his heart had simply stopped. No preceding symptoms, no physiological reason. It was as if it had been shut off. Sergeant Holbrook went to see the body before it was transferred to the morgue. She stood there looking at those 102 marks and understood the count hadn't stopped. It would never stop. Whatever had been initiated at mile 97 was now active, spreading, marking people across the region. She thought about her own investigation, about how deeply she'd involved herself. Had she made herself visible? Was she being watched? That night, back at the detachment, Holbrook drafted a report for her superiors. She recommended a full evacuation of the Bear Lake area, expansion of the exclusion zone around mile 97, and consultation with indigenous elders about the historical context. She knew it would sound irrational, but she had to try. Before she could send it, her computer screen flickered. Lines of text appeared, overriding her report. Counted, 103. Watched, Holbrook, D. Marked, pending. She stared at the screen, heart hammering. She hadn't typed that. No one else had access to her computer. She tried to close the document, but the text remained, now repeating across every program she opened. She shut down the computer entirely. The screen went black. Then it illuminated again on its own, showing a single number, 103. Holbrook grabbed her keys and left the detachment. She didn't go home. She drove south, toward Prince George, toward anywhere that wasn't the counting territory. She drove until she ran out of gas near Salmon Valley, then walked to the nearest farm and called her sister in Calgary. "I'm coming to stay with you," she said. "I can't explain why. I just need to be gone from here." Her sister heard the edge in her voice and didn't argue. Sergeant Diana Holbrook never returned to Mackenzie. She took extended medical leave, then resigned from the RCMP. She moved to Alberta and never spoke publicly about what happened during her investigation. But every night, before sleep, she counts. She can't help it. The compulsion is there, imprinted on her brain like a scar. She counts to 103 and stops. And she feels it watching, patiently, from a distance that never changes. She knows she's marked. She knows the count will reach her eventually. She's just trying to postpone it as long as possible. Back at Bear Lake, Thomas Coyne's cabin stood empty. Wildlife officers checked on it periodically, per protocol for abandoned structures. On June 15th, a conservation officer named Rebecca Kim visited the site for a routine inspection. She found the cabin covered in marks. Thousands of them, carved into every surface. Walls, floor, ceiling, furniture. All tally marks, all grouped in sequences from 97 to 103. And in the center of the room, scratched into the wooden floor in letters 3 feet high. It never stops counting. Rebecca photographed the scene and left quickly. She included the photos in her report and recommended the cabin be destroyed. The Forest Service agreed, but couldn't schedule a crew until July. The cabin burned down on June 23rd. The fire started spontaneously at 11:43 p.m., the same time Ellen Moss had vanished from her vehicle at mile 97. The blaze was so intense it consumed the entire structure in under an hour. When the fire inspector examined the site, he found no accelerant, no electrical cause, just ashes. And in the ashes, preserved impossibly, a single piece of charred wood bearing a tally sequence: 97, 98, 99, 100, 101, 102, 103, 104. The count had continued. Owen Mercier had worked at the WAC Bennett Dam for 18 years, starting as a maintenance worker and rising to senior operations technician. He knew every inch of the facility, the turbines, the spillways, the massive concrete structure that held back Williston Lake. He loved the work, the scale of it, the sense that he was maintaining something vital to the province's infrastructure. In early June 2019, he started hearing sounds. It began as a low-frequency hum, barely perceptible, felt more than heard. Owen first noticed it during a routine inspection of Turbine Bay 3. He stood on the metal catwalk, checking pressure gauges, when the hum started. It seemed to come from the water itself, from somewhere deep in the reservoir. He mentioned it to his supervisor, who chalked it up to normal operational sounds. Turbines created all sorts of acoustic phenomena, but the hum continued, and it began to change. By mid-June, Owen could distinguish patterns within it, rhythmic pulses, almost like beats or intervals. Like counting, he started recording the sounds on his phone. When he played them back at home, running them through audio software, he could see the waveform patterns. They weren't random. They repeated in sequences: long pulse, short pulse, short pulse, short pulse, short pulse, then reset. Again and again. Groups of 5 pulses. Like tally marks. Owen couldn't shake the feeling that something was communicating through the dam structure. He began spending extra hours at the facility, monitoring the sounds, tracking their intensity and frequency. He kept detailed logs: time of day, water levels, temperature, turbine output, looking for correlations. His colleagues started avoiding him. They said he'd become obsessed, talking about patterns in the water and messages from the reservoir. His supervisor ordered him to take time off, said he was working too much, needed rest. Owen refused. He knew something was happening. The sounds were getting stronger, more distinct, and they were moving, migrating through the dam structure, from turbine bay to turbine bay, as if whatever was creating them was exploring the facility. On June 20th, during a late-night shift, Owen was alone in the lower access tunnel when the sounds became deafening. Not loud in volume, but intense, undeniable, resonating through the concrete. He stood in the dim tunnel, surrounded by pipes and conduits, and felt the sound pass through his body like a physical presence. Then he heard something else, scratching, the sound of something marking stone. He followed the sound deeper into the tunnel, past the authorized access zone, into areas that hadn't been used in years. The emergency lighting cast everything in sickly yellow. The scratching continued, echoing off concrete. Owen found the marks in a maintenance alcove, fresh tally marks carved into the concrete wall, grouped in sequences. He counted them: 97, 98, 99, 100, 101, 102, 103, 104, 105. The last sequence was still being carved. He watched, frozen, as invisible force scored the concrete, stone dust falling as each mark appeared. The sound was rhythmic, methodical, patient. 106. Owen ran. He sprinted back through the tunnel, up the stairs, out into the operations center. He found his supervisor, grabbed him by the shoulders, and tried to explain what he'd seen. The words came out jumbled, incoherent. His supervisor thought Owen was having a breakdown. Security escorted Owen from the facility. He was placed on administrative leave, ordered to undergo a psychiatric evaluation before he could return to work. But Owen couldn't stop thinking about those marks, about the sound below the dam. He'd worked at the Bennett Dam for nearly 2 decades. He knew how much water it held back: 74 cubic kilometers, one of the largest reservoirs in North America. And now something was inside it, marking the structure, counting. What happened when it finished counting the dam? Owen tried to contact the RCMP, tried to reach Sergeant Holbrook, but she'd already left McKenzie. He called the RCMP detachment and spoke to whoever would listen, trying to explain that something from the mile 97 incidents had gotten into the reservoir, that it was now inside the dam itself. They thanked him politely and didn't follow up. His psychiatric evaluation was scheduled for July 3rd. On the night of June 28th, Owen drove to the dam. He parked in an overflow lot and walked to the service gate. His access card had been deactivated, but he knew the facility's security blind spots, knew where he could enter without being seen. He had to document what was happening. If no one would listen to his words, he'd get proof, photographs, video, recordings. He'd make them understand. Owen slipped into the facility through a maintenance access door and made his way to the lower tunnels. The sound was immediate, stronger than he'd ever felt it. The entire structure seemed to pulse with it, the concrete vibrating in rhythm. He descended to the deepest accessible level, where the massive intake pipes drew water from the reservoir to the turbines. The sound was overwhelming here, surrounding him, filling his head. The marks covered everything. Walls, ceiling, pipes, all carved with tallies, thousands of them, spreading like an infection through the facility. Some were old-looking, weathered. Others were fresh, dust still falling from them. Owen documented it all, his hands shaking as he photographed every surface. This was the proof. This would make them listen. Then he saw the water. One of the access panels to the intake system was open, and water was seeping through. Not a leak exactly, but water that moved against physics, flowing upward along the wall, defying gravity. And in the water, suspended in the liquid, were shapes. Human-shaped, marked with tallies, standing beneath the surface as if the water were holding them. Owen recognized one of them, Dennis Horvath, the millwright who disappeared at mile 97. He stood in the water, eyes open, body marked with tallies. Not dead, not alive, suspended, counted, held. All the missing were there, all the marked ones, standing in water that shouldn't exist, in a space that defied physics, waiting. 107 of them. Owen raised his camera. He had to capture this, had to. The water surged forward. It moved like a living thing, pouring through the open access panel, spreading across the floor. Owen stumbled backward, but the water followed. It touched his feet and he felt it. Cold beyond cold, heavy beyond heavy, and something inside it, something aware and measuring. He was being counted. The sensation lasted only seconds, but it changed everything. Owen understood now. The marks weren't random. Each one represented a door, a boundary point, a place where the living world touched the dead. And the thing that counted, the watcher, the surveyor, was mapping every single boundary, marking every door. The dam was a boundary, water and concrete, the living lake and the dead zone behind the barrier. It was a massive door, and the watcher was counting every part of it. When the count finished, Owen tried to move, tried to run, but his body wouldn't respond. He stood in the rising water, feeling it climb his legs, his waist, his chest. He could see himself reflected in the dark surface, and behind his reflection, other figures, marked and waiting. He was 108. The water reached his face. He felt the marks being carved into his chest, not painful, just present, inevitable. 97, 98, 99. Owen Mercier's body was found the next morning by the day shift. He drowned in a dry tunnel. There was no water, the access panel was closed and sealed, all systems normal. Yet his lungs were filled with lake water, and his body bore the signs of drowning. And across his chest and back were marks, 108 perfect tallies. The official investigation concluded that Owen had suffered a mental breakdown, somehow ingested lake water elsewhere, and collapsed in the tunnel. The psychological report noted his recent obsession with patterns and counts, and suggested he'd been experiencing auditory hallucinations. The carved marks throughout the lower tunnels were attributed to previous maintenance crews or board workers over the decades. The suggestion that they'd appeared recently was dismissed. Concrete aging analysis showed many of the marks were years old. But 3 members of the investigation team noted something in their personal logs. The marks in the tunnel where Owen died formed a complete count, starting at 97, progressing through 108, then starting over at 97. Repeating, overlapping, the tallies carved on top of tallies. As if something was counting the same sequence over and over, practice runs, preparing for a final count. The dam continued operating normally, but workers started reporting sounds, that low-frequency hum Owen had described. Maintenance requests increased for unexplained vibrations, acoustic anomalies, sounds of scratching in the walls. By July, 6 workers had requested transfers to other facilities, citing disturbing conditions but refusing to elaborate. BC Hydro attributed it to stress following Owen's death. The sounds continued, and in the deepest parts of the structure, where no one went anymore, the water still seeped through impossible cracks, pooling in spaces that should be dry. And the count went on. Father Gabriel Toussaint had served the small parish of Our Lady of the Pines in McKenzie for 11 years. He was a quiet man in his 60s, known for thoughtful homilies and a genuine pastoral presence. People came to him with their troubles, and he listened without judgment. In July 2019, his church became very busy. It started with Marie Horvath, widow of Dennis. She came to confession and spoke for nearly 2 hours about being marked, about seeing something on the winter roads, about numbers that wouldn't leave her alone. Father Gabriel listened, offered what comfort he could, and suggested grief counseling. Then came others. Within 3 weeks, he heard confessions from 17 people, all describing similar experiences, seeing figures that didn't stand on the ground, feeling washed by something patient and inevitable, obsessively counting, finding marks appearing on their property or bodies. Father Gabriel was a man of faith, not superstition. He believed in psychological trauma and how shared experiences could create mass anxiety. He referred people to mental health services, organized support groups, tried to provide a rational framework for their fears. But he couldn't ignore the consistency of their accounts. And he couldn't ignore what he started experiencing himself. It began with whispers during Massachusetts. He'd be delivering the Eucharist or reading scripture when he'd hear soft counting, barely perceptible, coming from the back pews. When he looked, no one would be counting aloud, but the sound continued. 97, 98, 99. Then he started finding marks. Small tallies scratched into the confessional booth, the altar, even the pages of the parish Bible. He'd find 5 marks, then 5 more, then 5 more. Always in groups, always methodical. He tried to rationalize it. Vandals, perhaps. Troubled parishioners acting out. But the marks appeared overnight, in locked spaces, with no signs of entry. Father Gabriel decided to investigate the history. He spent days in the diocesan archives in Prince George, looking for any records of unusual events in the McKenzie area. He found scattered references. A missionary in 1891 reporting native concerns about spirits that count the dead near Parsnip Reach. A priest in 1952 mentioning persistent folk beliefs about markers in the forest during the construction of early logging roads. Most striking was a letter from 1967, written by Father Edmund Rourke, who'd served a parish near the Finley River before it was flooded by the Bennett Dam. Rourke described an encounter with a Seikani elder who'd warned him that the flooding would disturb the counting places, and that, when the count completes, the door between will fail. Rourke had dismissed it as cultural mythology, but he'd noted one detail. The elder said the counting had been happening for generations, maintained by specific rituals performed by designated families. Without those rituals, without the proper acknowledgement, the count would accelerate. Father Gabriel photocopied the letter and brought it back to McKenzie. He read it again in his small rectory office, trying to understand. If there was something spiritual happening, not psychological, not folkloric, but genuinely spiritual, then perhaps his role wasn't to rationalize but to acknowledge. That night, he prayed. Not his usual liturgical prayers, but something deeper, more direct. He asked for understanding. He asked for guidance. He asked for protection for his congregation. He fell asleep at his desk and woke at 3:47 a.m. to the sound of scratching. It came from the church sanctuary, steady and rhythmic. Father Gabriel grabbed a flashlight and walked down the dark hallway. The sanctuary doors were closed but unlocked. He pushed them open. The church was filled with figures. They stood in the pews, in the aisles, at the altar. Dozens of them, maybe more, all facing forward as if attending Massachusetts. They were translucent, not quite solid, and they didn't stand on the ground. They hovered, just slightly elevated, in that distinctive way he'd heard described. Each one bore marks, tallies carved into their bodies, visible through their translucent forms. Father Gabriel should have run. Every instinct screamed at him to flee. But he was a priest, and these were souls, lost, counted, trapped. He stepped into the sanctuary. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit," he said, making the sign of the cross. "I acknowledge you. I see you. You are witnessed." The figures turned toward him in unison. Their faces were people he recognized: Dennis Horvath, Constable Pettigrew, Dr. Ellen Moss, Thomas Coyne, Owen Mercier, others he didn't know. All they counted once. They didn't speak, but he heard them anyway, not with his ears, but directly in his mind, a chorus of voices overlapping. "We are marked. We are held. We are the boundary." The count continues. 109, 110, 111. It will not stop. The door will not hold. Witness us. Count us. Remember us. Father Gabriel felt tears streaming down his face. "What do you need? How can I help you?" The response was immediate, overwhelming. Break the count. Disrupt the pattern. Refuse to be marked. One must refuse. Then they were gone. The sanctuary was empty, silent, ordinary. But the message remained, echoing in his head. Father Gabriel spent the rest of the night writing. He documented everything: the confessions, the marks, the historical records, his vision in the sanctuary. He wrote letters to the bishop, to the RCMP, to anyone who might listen. He explained that something was happening in Mackenzie that couldn't be addressed by conventional means. He mailed the letters the next morning. Then he prepared his homily for Sunday Mass. On July 21st, Father Gabriel stood before his congregation, larger than usual, nearly every pew filled, and spoke. "I believe you," he said. "All of you who've come to me with stories of being marked, of being watched, of counting against your will, I believe you. Something is happening here that we don't fully understand, but it's real. You're not crazy. You're not alone." He described what he'd experienced, what he'd learned from historical records, the message from the vision. He spoke about the power of witness, of acknowledgement, of refusing to let fear silence truth. "If this is spiritual warfare," he concluded, "then we fight with faith, with community, with the refusal to be isolated and counted. We stand together. We acknowledge what's happening, and we refuse to let it mark us without resistance." The congregation was silent for a long moment. Then Marie Horvath stood. "Thank you, Father, for believing us." Others stood as well. Within minutes, nearly everyone in the church was on their feet, a silent affirmation. That night, Father Gabriel felt at peace for the first time in weeks. He'd done what he could. He'd witnessed, acknowledged, provided spiritual guidance. Whatever happened next was in God's hands. He died in his sleep that night. The coroner found no cause of death. His heart simply stopped. But across his chest were marks, 112 perfect tallies. The church found him the next morning. His face was peaceful, his hands folded as if in prayer. On his desk was his journal, open to the last entry. "I am counted. I accept this, but I have broken their isolation. The marked ones know they are seen, witnessed, remembered. That may be enough." The count continues, but it no longer happens in silence. That changes something. I don't know what, but I believe it matters. If one must refuse, let it be someone younger, someone with more life to protect. I have lived well. I can be number 112 if it serves a purpose. God forgive me if I'm wrong. The funeral was attended by over 200 people, more than had been at any service in the church's history. People came from across northern BC, many of them marked ones, receivers who'd been touched by the phenomenon. They stood together, acknowledged their experiences, and for the first time, the isolation broke. They formed a support group, started a private online forum, shared strategies for managing the counting compulsion. It didn't stop the marking. It didn't end the phenomenon, but it changed how people experienced it. No longer alone, no longer silent, no longer suffering in isolation. Father Gabriel's last act had been to create witness, and in witnessing, to create resistance. The count continued, but now people were watching back. Naomi Frost had worked as an archivist for the BC provincial government for 6 years, specializing in historical land surveys and resource management documents. She operated out of a small office in Prince George, cataloging and digitizing decades of paper records that few people ever requested. In August 2019, she received an unusual assignment. The RCMP had requested all historical documents related to BC Hydro's construction of the W.C. Bennett Dam, specifically surveys and Indigenous consultation records from the 1960s. They were following up on concerns raised during a recent investigation. Naomi pulled the files, dozens of boxes containing survey maps, construction reports, environmental assessments, and correspondence. She began the methodical work of cataloging each document, scanning them into the provincial database. That's when she found the restricted folder. It was mislabeled, filed under engineering reports, but marked with a code she didn't recognize, CM Restricted Cultural. Inside were documents that shouldn't have been in the engineering section, anthropological reports, correspondence with indigenous communities, and something labeled Finley River Survey, anomalous structures. Naomi knew she should flag it for her supervisor, but curiosity won. She opened the survey report. It described an expedition in December 1965, just before the final flooding of the Finley River Valley. A team of surveyors had documented everything that would be submerged, including indigenous sites, trap lines, and abandoned structures. They'd found something they couldn't explain. At coordinates, redacted, surveyors discovered a wooden structure of unknown origin. The building contains extensive markings on interior walls, floor, and ceiling, thousands of carved symbols resembling tally marks. Local Seikani consultants refused to enter the structure and requested it be destroyed before flooding. They stated it was a counting place that must not be preserved or disturbed. Recommend immediate demolition. Attached was a photograph, the counting house, the same building from Dr. James Rothwell's research. On the door, painted clearly, 97. But there was a second photograph Naomi hadn't seen in any previous reports. This one showed the interior of the building. The walls were covered in marks, but they weren't random. They formed patterns, spirals, grids, sequences that seemed to have mathematical structure. And in the center of the floor was a depression, roughly circular, filled with what looked like dark water. The caption read, "Standing pool, depth unknown. Water does not drain despite sandy soil. Seikani consultants call this the door that drinks." Naomi kept reading. The report recommended the building be burned and the site buried under rock fill before flooding. A demolition crew was dispatched on January 12, 1966. But there was a follow-up memo, dated January 15, 1966, marked urgent. Demolition crew reports failure to destroy structure. Building burned. But during site inspection the following day, structure was found intact. Fire damage minimal. Second attempt with explosives yielded same result, initial destruction, but structure found intact upon return visit. Seikani consultant, name withheld, states, "You cannot destroy a door. You can only close it or open it. Burning it, breaking it. These are openings." Recommendation, seal the entrance and flood as planned. The reservoir water may provide sufficient closure. Naomi felt ice in her stomach. They'd flooded the counting house. It was down there, in Williston Lake, sealed underwater, except the water hadn't closed it. The bodies pulled from the lake, the dive operations, Owen Mercier's drowning in a dry tunnel. The door was open. The water had opened it. She kept digging through the file. More memos, more reports, most heavily redacted. But she found one document that made her hands shake. A list of personnel affected by proximity to structure. 7 names. All members of the demolition crew or survey team. Next to each name was a date and a note. Name: disappeared January 30th, 1966. Search unsuccessful. Marks found at last known location. The count had been happening for decades, longer than anyone realized. Naomi photocopied everything. She knew she was violating protocol. These were restricted documents, but this was too important. She had to get this information to someone who could act on it. She tried contacting the RCMP detachment in McKenzie, but Sergeant Holbrook was gone and no one else would take her seriously. She tried Dr. James Rothwell at UBC, but he'd taken a leave of absence after the dive incident. She tried journalists, but after the sensationalized coverage of the Mile 97 disappearances, no one wanted to touch another Northern BC mystery story. Frustrated, Naomi created a private website. She uploaded all the documents she'd copied, organized them chronologically, and added her own analysis. She explained the pattern, the counting house, the failed demolitions, the flooding, the continuation of disappearances. She showed how the count had been progressing for over 50 years, accelerating in recent decades. She titled the website The Boundary Archive and posted a link on several BC history forums, indigenous rights groups, and paranormal investigation sites. Then she waited. The response was immediate. Within 24 hours, she had hundreds of messages. Some were from marked ones, people who'd experienced the counting phenomenon and were desperate for information. Others were from researchers, historians, and indigenous community members who added their own pieces to the puzzle. One message stood out. It came from a Sakonee elder named Margaret John, who lived in Fort Ware. She wrote, "My grandfather was one of the consultants in 1965. He tried to stop them from flooding the counting place. He said there are many such places in our territory, boundaries where the living world and the dead world meet. Our people had rituals to keep these boundaries stable, to prevent the count from completing. When the flooding happened, when our people were displaced, the rituals stopped. The boundaries began to fail. What you call disappearances and markings, we call the consequence of broken stewardship. The counter has no one to answer to anymore, so it counts without limit. It will continue until someone restores the ritual or until the count completes and all boundaries fail." Naomi arranged to meet Margaret in person. She drove to Fort Ware, a small community 300 kilometers north of McKenzie, and spent 2 days listening to oral histories, learning about the traditional understanding of the counting places. "The counter isn't evil," Margaret explained. "It's necessary. It maintains balance between worlds. But it needs to be witnessed, acknowledged, and concluded by people who understand what they're seeing. Without that, it just counts forever, marking more and more, opening more and more doors. Eventually, there will be no boundary at all. How do we stop it?" Naomi asked. "You can't stop it. You can only complete it properly. Someone has to go to the counting place, witness the full count, and close the door. It requires understanding the count, accepting it, and then refusing to be held by it. The rituals were complex. It took years to train someone to do this. We don't have anyone trained anymore. What happens if no one does it?" Margaret's expression was grim. "The count reaches a point where the boundary fails completely. The marked ones don't stay marked. They become part of the boundary itself, permanently trapped between worlds. And the living world begins to overlap with the dead. The entire territory becomes a counting place. No one can live here anymore." Naomi returned to Prince George with a terrible understanding. The phenomenon wasn't going to stop on its own. It needed human intervention, but the knowledge of how to intervene had been largely lost. She updated the boundary archive with everything Margaret had shared. She made the site more visible, adding it to search engines, contacting media outlets, trying to raise awareness. On August 29th, her website was taken down. She received an official letter from the provincial government. She'd violated confidentiality protocols by publishing restricted documents and was terminated from her position effective immediately. The documents she'd uploaded were removed, and she was warned against further disclosure. But it was too late. Hundreds of people had already downloaded the archive. The information was out, spreading through networks of marked ones, researchers, and concerned citizens. Naomi had created something Father Gabriel had started: widespread witness. People across northern BC now understood what was happening. The isolation was broken, but the count continued. When Naomi checked her final backup of the archive, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Someone had edited the site before it was taken down. A new section had appeared, one she hadn't created. It was a list of names. All the marked ones. All the disappeared. All those who'd been counted. At the bottom was a number, 127. The count had accelerated. It was no longer taking weeks between marks. It was happening daily. Multiple people were being counted at once. Naomi looked at the list. She didn't see her own name yet, but she knew it was only a matter of time. She'd made herself visible. She'd investigated, documented, published. She was a receiver now, whether she liked it or not. She had a choice: flee and hope distance provided protection, or stay and try to document what came next. She chose to stay. Someone needed to keep the archive. Someone needed to witness. Naomi created a new website, this time using encryption and offshore hosting. She called it The Counting, a living archive of the northern BC boundary phenomenon. She updated it daily with new reports, new disappearances, new marks. She knew she was racing against time. Eventually, she would be counted. But until then, she would make sure the truth was preserved. Her last entry was dated September 14th, 2019. The count is at 149 as of today. The rate is exponential now. What took decades is now taking days. I've been feeling watched for 2 weeks. I found marks on my apartment door yesterday, 5 groups of 5, then 4 more. Number 149 might be me. If you're reading this and I stop updating, assume I've been counted. The archive will continue through automated backups. Someone needs to remember. Someone needs to witness. That's all we can do now. Witness and remember until someone who understands the old ways can close the door properly. Don't let this be forgotten. Don't let it happen in silence. Naomi Frost was reported missing on September 16th. Her apartment was undisturbed, computer still running, website still active. But she was gone. The counting archive updated automatically with her disappearance. Number 149 confirmed. The count continued. By late September 2019, the situation in northern British Columbia had reached a crisis point that couldn't be ignored, though official responses remained inadequate. The counting phenomenon, as it was now widely known, had spread beyond Mackenzie and Williston Lake to encompass a region spanning thousands of square kilometers. Reports came in daily. Figures on roads, marks appearing on buildings, people vanishing without trace. The count, according to Naomi Frost's still active archive, had reached 183. The rate was accelerating exponentially. What had started as isolated incidents separated by weeks or months was now happening multiple times per day. Indigenous communities across the region began relocating. Fort Ware, McLeod Lake, and several smaller settlements were partially evacuated as people fled south or west, away from the epicenter of the phenomenon. The provincial government attributed it to unrelated personal decisions and maintained there was no official reason for concern. But those who remained, and those who were tracking the phenomenon, knew better. Something was building toward a conclusion. The count was approaching a threshold. On September 28th, 5 people simultaneously reported the same vision. They'd seen the marked ones, all of them, standing together in a clearing near Williston Lake. Not physical people, but the translucent, hovering figures that characterized the counted. They stood in formation, arranged in precise patterns, rows of 97, then rows of 98, ascending up to 183. The visions included a location, a GPS coordinate that, when checked, corresponded to a point on the northwestern shore of Williston Lake, the exact site where the counting house had stood before the flooding. A group of 23 people decided to go there. They were all receivers, marked ones who'd survived being counted, people who'd investigated too deeply, family members of the disappeared who'd become sensitive to the phenomenon. They called themselves the witnesses, and they understood they were likely going to die. But they had to see. They had to understand what happened when the count reached its conclusion. And if Margaret John's information was correct, maybe one of them could do what the old rituals had done, close the door properly. Among the witnesses were Sarah Chun, the journalist who'd been marked as 98 but survived; Douglas Keller, grandson of the trapper who'd first seen the counting house; Marie Horvath, widow of Dennis; Rebecca Kim, the conservation officer who'd found the marks at Bear Lake; and 16 others, each with their own connection to the phenomenon. They met in Mackenzie on September 30th and caravan north on logging roads, following GPS coordinates to the northwestern shore of Williston Lake. It took 4 hours of rough driving, the last 2 on roads barely maintained. They reached the site at dusk. The shore was rocky, the water dark and still. The forest pressed close, and the air had a quality they all felt, thick, expectant, as if reality itself were holding its breath. They made camp and waited. At 11:43 p.m., the recurring significant time, the lake began to glow. A pale blue luminescence emerged from the deep water, growing brighter. The witnesses stood at the shore and watched as the water surface became transparent, revealing what lay beneath. The counting house was there, 50 meters down, perfectly preserved. Around it stood figures, hundreds of them, all the counted ones, arranged in precise formation. And above them, moving through the water as if it were air, was something else. The watcher. It was difficult to perceive, even when directly visible. A presence more than a form, a concentration of attention and intention. It moved among the counted ones, and as it touched each, a light would glow briefly on their chest. The marks, illuminated from within. It was counting them, reviewing them, verifying the tally. Sarah Chun grabbed Douglas Keller's arm. It's checking its work. It's preparing for something. The watcher descended to the counting house and entered. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then light began to emanate from the structure. Not the pale blue glow, but something warmer, deeper, golden almost. The door in the lake was opening fully. Marie Horvath whispered, "My husband is down there. Dennis is down there. Can they be brought back?" No one answered. They didn't know. The golden light intensified, spreading through the water, reaching toward the surface. Where it touched, the boundary between water and air seemed to shimmer, becoming indistinct. The counted ones began to rise, ascending through the lake as if climbing invisible stairs. They emerged onto the shore, water streaming from them but not dripping. It returned to the lake as if being pulled back. Nearly 200 figures stood before the witnesses, marked and silent, hovering just above the ground. The witnesses could see their faces now. Dennis Horvath, Constable Pettigrew, Dr. Ellen Moss, Thomas Coyne, Owen Mercier, Father Gabriel Toussaint, Naomi Frost, Marcus LeBlanc, and so many others. All marked, all counted, all held in the space between living and dead. Then the watcher emerged. It rose from the lake as a column of light and shadow, never quite resolving into a single form. Eyes perceived it differently. Some saw a tall figure in ragged clothing. Others saw an absence shaped like a person. Others saw pure geometry, angles and lines that hurt to observe. But all agreed on one thing. It was looking at them, counting them. Rebecca Kim stepped forward. "What do you want? Why are you doing this?" The response came not as sound, but as knowing, directly into their minds. "I measure. I mark. I maintain the boundary. This is my function. This has always been my function." "But you're trapping people," Saracen said. "You're taking the living and making them neither alive nor dead. The boundary must be marked. Every door must be counted. When the count is complete, the boundary holds. Without counting, the worlds merge. Chaos. Dissolution." Douglas Keller spoke up. "The Dakal and Seikani people used to help you. They performed rituals to complete the count, but they were displaced. The rituals stopped. Is that why the count never completes? Is that why you keep counting?" The witnesses were removed. The acknowledgement ceased. The count cannot complete without proper witness. "I continue. I mark. I wait for completion." Understanding dawned on the witnesses. The watcher wasn't malevolent. It was trapped in its own function, unable to complete its task because the human element, the ritual acknowledgement, the proper closing of the count, had been lost. It had been counting for over 50 years, unable to stop, unable to complete, marking more and more people because each count failed to achieve the necessary closure. Marie Horvath stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "If we witness you properly, if we acknowledge the count the way the old rituals did, will you release them? Will you release my husband and all the others?" Proper witness allows release. Proper acknowledgement allows completion. The marked ones can return if the boundary is properly sealed. But the witness must accept the final mark. The witness must become the doorkeeper. The group fell silent, understanding the price. One of them would have to take the final mark, become the permanent boundary marker, the anchor that allowed all others to be released. One person would have to remain counted forever. Saracen looked at the others. "I'm already marked as 98. I've tried to die to avoid being counted. Maybe this is why I survived, so I could choose this. Consciously. Willingly." "No," Douglas Keller said. "It should be me. My grandfather saw the counting house first. My family has been connected to this for generations. It's our responsibility." Marie shook her head. "Dennis is down there because of me. Because I survived. Let me be the one who brings him back." They argued quietly, each offering themselves, each claiming the right to be the final mark. Until Rebecca Kim said something that stopped them all. "What if we share it? What if all 23 of us accept the mark together? Distribute the burden across all of us?" The watcher's presence shifted, as if considering. Then, 23 witnesses, 23 marks. The count becomes 183 plus 23 equals 206. Distributed marking is acceptable, novel, the burden shared, the boundary maintained by many rather than one. This may work. The witnesses looked at each other. They understood what they were accepting. They would be permanently marked, permanently sensitive to the boundary between worlds. They would feel the count always, be aware of the thin places, carry the weight of maintaining balance. But they would be alive, and the 183 who'd been held in suspension could be released. One by one, the witnesses agreed. The watcher moved among them, and each felt the touch, cold beyond cold, present beyond present. Marks appeared on their bodies, not carved but manifested from within. 23 marks for each of them, representing their share of the burden. When the last witness was marked, the watcher returned to the shore where the counted ones stood. It touched each one, and as it did, their marks faded. The golden light surrounding them intensified, then released. Dennis Horvath gasped, drawing a sudden breath as if breaking through water. He staggered, caught himself, looked around in confusion. He was alive, fully alive, no longer suspended between states. One by one, the counted ones returned to life. Constable Pettigrew, Dr. Moss, Thomas Coyne, Owen Mercier, Father Gabriel, Naomi Frost, all gasping, confused, alive. Those who'd been dead too long, whose bodies had been buried or were too damaged, faded gently away, their spirits released to move on properly rather than being held in limbo. In the end, 73 people returned to full life. 110 moved on to death, properly released. And 23 witnesses carried the marks, becoming the new stewards of the boundary. The watcher addressed them one final time. The count is complete. 206 witnesses now maintain the boundary. The door in this place is closed. But other doors exist. Other counting places wait throughout the territory. You are now stewards. You will feel when new counts begin. You must witness them. You must help me complete them before they reach crisis. This is the burden you have accepted. Then it descended back into the lake. The golden light faded. The water became dark and opaque again. The counting house remained visible for a moment more, then vanished as if it had never been. The survivors helped each other back to the vehicles. Dennis Horvath was reunited with Marie, both crying, neither quite believing it was real. The others who'd returned to life were disoriented, missing months or years of memory, but alive. The witnesses felt different. They carried the marks, visible only to each other and to those sensitive to the boundary. They could feel the thin places now, since when counting was happening, know when someone was being marked. They had become what the indigenous stewards once were, guardians of the boundary, witnesses to the count, partners with the watcher in maintaining the balance between worlds. The convergence at Williston Lake was never officially acknowledged. The returned dead were treated as missing persons who'd been found, suffering from exposure and amnesia. Medical examinations showed impossible results. Some had been dead for years, but were now alive, so the records were classified or lost. The witnesses dispersed across British Columbia, but they stayed in contact. They created a network, sharing information about boundary phenomena, responding when new counting began, providing witness before it reached crisis. They'd saved northern BC from complete boundary collapse, but they knew the work was never finished. The count would always continue, in new places, in new ways. The boundary between worlds requires constant maintenance, and now, 23 people carried that responsibility. Winter returned to northern British Columbia in November 2019. Snow fell early and heavy, blanketing the forests and freezing the smaller lakes. Life in Mackenzie returned to something approximating normal. People went to work, children attended school, the Tim Hortons remained busy. But for those who knew, for those who'd been touched by the counting, nothing would ever be truly normal again. Sarah Chin sat in a coffee shop in Prince George, her laptop open, maintaining the counting archive. She'd renamed it the Boundary Project and transformed it from a repository of disappearances into a resource for understanding thin places, counting phenomena, and spiritual geography across BC and beyond. She received messages daily from across North America, people reporting similar phenomena, patterns of disappearances, recurring numbers, feelings of being watched by something neither alive nor dead. The Mile 97 events weren't unique. They were part of a larger pattern, boundary failures happening worldwide, accelerating. Sarah carried 23 marks on her chest, and she could feel them always. They were warm, slightly raised, almost comforting. They reminded her of her responsibility: witness, document, help complete counts before they reached crisis. She'd been called to 3 emerging situations since the Williston Lake convergence. Each time, She and other witnesses had traveled to thin places, provided acknowledgement and ritual closure, partnered with the Watcher to complete counts properly. Each time, they prevented the kind of escalation that had happened at mile 97. It was exhausting work, but it felt purposeful in a way her journalism never had. She was literally helping maintain the fabric of reality. Douglas Keller had returned to his home near Bear Lake. He'd inherited his grandfather's trap lines, though he no longer trapped. Instead, he maintained the old counting places throughout his territory, visiting them regularly, performing simple acknowledgments. He'd learned basic Dakel and Seikani protocols from Margaret John and other elders, adapting them for his own use. He felt his grandfather's presence sometimes, proud and approving. This work should have passed down through his family naturally, but displacement and assimilation had broken that transmission. Now Douglas was reclaiming it, rebuilding what had been lost. He'd even found 3 young people, 2 Seikani and 1 Dakel, interested in learning the stewardship practices. He taught them what he knew, and they taught him what remained in their community's memory. Together, they were creating a new generation of boundary stewards. Marie Horvath lived in McKinsey with Dennis, who'd returned to work at the pulp mill. He remembered nothing from his time as a counted one. Those months were simply gone from his memory. But he'd changed. He was gentler, more present, as if his time between worlds had given him perspective on what mattered. Marie had become one of the most active witnesses. She could sense thin places with particular clarity, often feeling them days before they became critical. She developed a network of contacts across northern BC, people who'd call her when they experienced boundary phenomena. She'd assess the situation, coordinate with other witnesses, and help provide closure. She'd found her purpose in the work. The trauma of losing Dennis had been transformed into mission. She was helping prevent others from experiencing what she'd gone through. Rebecca Kim had left her position as a conservation officer and now worked as an independent environmental consultant. But her real work was mapping thin places. She'd created a detailed GIS database of every location in BC where boundary phenomena had been reported, overlaying them with geological features, indigenous territorial boundaries, and historical events. Patterns emerged. Thin places often correlated with sites of significant death, old burial grounds, battle sites, places where many had died quickly. But they also appeared at liminal features, where rivers joined, where valleys ended, where ecosystems transitioned. The land itself had boundaries, and those natural boundaries sometimes aligned with spiritual ones. Rebecca's mapping helped identify potential crisis sites before counts reached critical mass. Together, the 23 witnesses had formed an invisible network maintaining the boundary across northern BC. They didn't have official recognition or support. The government had classified most information about the Mile 97 events and discouraged public discussion. But the witnesses didn't need official sanction. They had each other, and they had partnership with the Watcher. In late December 2019, Sarah received a message from an unknown sender. New count beginning. Location, Highway 16, west of Prince George. Estimated current number, 37. Accelerating. Require witness within 72 hours. The message was signed with a simple symbol, a tally mark. It was from the Watcher itself. Sarah made the calls. Within 6 hours, 8 witnesses were en route to the Highway 16 location. They met at a rest stop at kilometer 127 and began their work, observing, acknowledging, documenting. They identified the thin place, a bridge over the Willow River where 17 people had died in various accidents over 3 decades. The count had reached 43. The Watcher was present, marking those who died without proper acknowledgement. The witnesses performed their protocols, provided the acknowledgement, helped complete the count at 43 rather than letting it spiral to hundreds. Crisis averted. Boundary maintained. Afterward, as they shared coffee in Prince George, Douglas said what they were all thinking. This is our life now. This is what we inherited when we accepted the marks. We're stewards. Forever. Sarah nodded. But we're not alone. And we're building something. Knowledge, practices, a community. Maybe eventually this work will be recognized again. The way it was before colonization disrupted everything. Until then, Marie added, we do what we do. We witness. We count with intention instead of letting the counting happen blindly. We maintain the boundary. They raised their coffee cups in a quiet toast. To witnessing. To stewardship. to the work that never ended but gave their lives meaning. That night, back in her apartment, Sarah updated the Boundary Project website. She wrote, "The Mile 97 events of 2019 revealed something that indigenous peoples have always known. There are boundaries between worlds, and those boundaries require maintenance. When that maintenance is neglected, when the rituals and acknowledgments stop, the boundaries begin to fail. People become caught between worlds, neither alive nor dead. Counts reach crisis. Doors open that should remain closed." But the events also revealed something else. The work can be reclaimed. New stewards can accept the responsibility. The boundary can be maintained, not through official programs or government oversight, but through voluntary commitment by those who understand what's at stake. We are those stewards now. 23 people who carry marks, who feel thin places, who partner with forces older than civilization to keep the world separate and stable. This website will continue to document our work, share our knowledge, and build community among those who sense the boundary. If you've experienced counting phenomena, if you felt marked, if you sense that reality is thinner in some places than others, you're not crazy. You're perceiving something real. Reach out. Join us. The work needs more stewards, especially in regions where indigenous knowledge systems were suppressed or destroyed. The count never truly ends, but neither do the witnesses. Sarah posted the update and closed her laptop. Through her apartment window, she could see snow falling, thick and silent. Winter had fully arrived. She touched the marks on her chest, feeling them warm beneath her fingers. She thought about all those who'd been counted before the witnesses learned how to provide proper closure. She thought about Dennis Horvath standing alone on a dark road, seeing something he couldn't understand. About Constable Pettigrew investigating a pattern he couldn't explain. About Dr. Moss trying to rationalize the irrational. About Father Gabriel witnessing what his congregation needed witnessed. They'd all been part of something larger, a pattern working itself out across time. Their suffering hadn't been meaningless. It had revealed the problem and, ultimately, pointed toward the solution. The boundary required witnesses, and now there were witnesses. Sarah's phone buzzed. Another message, another potential thin place requiring attention. She read the details. Terrace, British Columbia, Highway 37, a logging camp where 3 workers had recently vanished. She made the calls, coordinated the response. Other witnesses would travel to Terrace, assess the situation, provide acknowledgement if needed. The work continued. Outside, snow fell on Mackenzie, on Williston Lake, on Mile 97, on all the counting places scattered across northern British Columbia. The winter was long and dark, and the boundary between worlds remained thin in the cold. But the witnesses were watching, and in watching, they maintained the balance. The count went on, 206, 207, 208, but now each number was witnessed, acknowledged, properly completed. The counted ones were released rather than trapped. The boundary held, and in the deep waters of Williston Lake, the counting house stood silent and closed, its doors sealed by proper witness, waiting, always waiting, because the boundary never stops being counted. But now, finally, it was being counted right. The events described in these accounts are based on reported disappearances, historical records, and oral traditions from northern British Columbia. The specific details have been altered to protect privacy and respect ongoing investigations. The Boundary Project maintains an archive of similar phenomena worldwide. If you have experienced counting phenomena or boundary events, documentation is available at Redacted. Remember, the boundary requires witness. Do not let it count in silence.